blood has a smell. Not the metallic thing people describe in books. It's warmer than that, almost sweet, like pennies left too long in a closed fist. I know that smell now. I knew it the night the world turned upside down on a stretch of dark highway, glass raining into my lap like something out of a nightmare I never asked to have. My name is Amara Whitfield, and I was 29 years old the night my family left me to die. We'd been driving back from my grandmother's memorial dinner, my mother Vivian behind the wheel, my father Marcus beside her, my younger sister Renee, and my older brother Cedric crammed into the back seat with me. The mood in that car had been strange all night, tight around the edges, like everyone was holding their breath around a secret. I didn't know yet that the secret was me, or rather, what I was about to become. A truck ran the light. Metal screamed. My head hit the window, and the last clear thing I remember is my mother's voice, not screaming for me, but hissing at my father, "We can't be here when they come. Not with what's in the glove box." I remember Cedric's hand on the door. I remember Renee's face, pale and refusing to look at me. I remember being pulled, not helped, pulled out of the wreckage and laid on the gravel shoulder like a bag no longer worth carrying. Then headlights. Retreating. The taillights of my mother's car shrinking into the dark while I lay there, bleeding from a gash above my eye, my collarbone broken, whispering a name into the night that nobody answered. They left me. My own blood left me bleeding on the side of a road and drove into the dark like I had never existed. I didn't die. A trucker named Otis Green found me 40 minutes later, still conscious, still furious, and that fury is the only thing that kept my heart beating until the ambulance came. I spent the next 14 months rebuilding my body and, something far more dangerous, a plan. Because before that crash, before the glove box and the secret and the taillights vanishing into the night, I had already stumbled onto the reason they wanted me gone. And now, after everything, I was coming home. Not to forgive. To collect. 14 months is a long time to lie in silence and listen to a house grieve without you. I healed in a rehabilitation center 3 states away, paid for with money my family didn't know I had, money my grandmother, Odessa Whitfield, had quietly wired into an account only I knew existed, 6 weeks before she died. She'd called it insurance, and at the time I laughed, thinking she was just an old woman being sentimental. I didn't understand until much later that Grandma Odessa had seen something coming long before I did. The doctors said I was lucky. Fractured collarbone, a concussion, 41 stitches above my eyebrow that left a thin silver scar I never bothered to hide. I liked the way it looked in the mirror. It reminded me every morning that my family had made a choice and I had survived it. While my body healed, I used my hands for something else, paperwork. Grandma Odessa had built a modest, but fiercely profitable chain of beauty supply stores across the region. 3 decades of grinding, underpaid, underestimated labor turned into something real. Everyone assumed the business would pass to my father, her only son. Everyone assumed wrong. 2 weeks before the accident, her lawyer, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Cassandra Boone, had called me into her office and told me the truth. Grandma Odessa's will named me as sole heir to the business, the properties, and a trust fund worth more than my father's mortgage on our family house. My father had found out. I don't know how, maybe he'd bribed someone in that law office, maybe my mother had overheard a phone call. But 3 days later, we were all piling into that car for a family dinner, and 3 days after that, I was bleeding on a highway shoulder while my family's taillights disappeared. It wasn't an accident that made them leave me. The crash was real. But the choice to drive away? That was calculated. That was cowardice with a destination. From my hospital bed, I started making calls. Quiet ones. To Cassandra Boone. To Otis, the trucker who'd saved my life and who, it turned out, used to drive freight for my grandmother's stores decades ago and never forgot her kindness. To an accountant named Priya Nazari, who owed my grandmother a debt so old it had calcified into loyalty. By the time I could walk without a cane, I wasn't the same woman who'd been thrown from that car. I was building something. And my family had no idea it was aimed directly at them. The first door I closed didn't belong to my parents. It belonged to my sister. Renee was getting married. I found out through a mutual cousin, Talia, who still texted me sometimes out of guilt, I think, or maybe just because she'd never fully agreed with what the family did that night. The wedding was set to be extravagant. My sister always wanted the kind of celebration that made people whisper her name with envy, and it was being funded, in large part, by a sponsorship deal Renee had landed with a regional hair and beauty brand. The brand's name was Lustrous Crown Cosmetics. I recognized it immediately because I owned 11% of its parent holding company through an investment Grandma Odessa had made years before her death, folded quietly into the trust that was now mine. I didn't destroy the deal out of spite. I told myself that, anyway, lying awake at 2 a.m. in my new apartment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the old ache in my collarbone whenever the weather changed. I told myself this was business, not vengeance. Cassandra Boone made one phone call to the board. 1. She mentioned, almost casually, that a Whitfield family scandal was quietly circulating, a woman abandoned on the roadside after a car accident, left to bleed while her family fled a scene under mysterious circumstances involving a glove box nobody would explain. She mentioned that this woman controlled a meaningful stake in their holding company. She mentioned that this woman would appreciate her family's affairs staying far away from anything she had a financial interest in. 3 days later, Lustrous Crown Cosmetics withdrew its sponsorship of Renee's wedding, citing reputational concerns. I heard about it from Talia, who sent me a single text. They're saying somebody tanked the deal on purpose. Was it you? I didn't answer right away. I sat with the question, turning it over like a stone in my palm, feeling its weight. Then I typed back 4 words, I don't know her. It wasn't quite a lie. The Renee who had once braided my hair on Sunday mornings, who had cried at my college graduation, who had once been my closest friend in that house, she didn't exist anymore. She died on that highway shoulder too, the moment she looked at my bleeding face and chose to get back in the car. The wedding didn't cancel, but it shrank. The venue changed. The guest list changed. And somewhere in my sister's perfect, curated life, a crack had opened that she couldn't explain. She had no idea I was the one holding the hammer. My brother Cedric was next, though I hadn't planned it that way. Life has its own rhythm sometimes, and doors don't always close in the order you expect. Cedric had been building a campaign for city council for almost a year, riding on charisma and the Whitfield family name, a name our grandmother had spent 30 years making mean something in our community. He used to stand on porches with his sleeves rolled up, promising to fight for people who looked like us, and I used to believe him, back when I still believed in most things about my family. What Cedric didn't know was that I had been quietly funding 2 community initiatives through Odessa Whitfield's charitable foundation, a scholarship program and a small business incubator, both of which had, over the years, become deeply respected in the neighborhoods he needed most. I didn't attack him directly. I simply stopped being invisible. At a town hall 3 weeks before the primary, a young reporter named Deshaun Marks, sharp, hungry, the kind of journalist who still believed truth mattered, asked Cedric a question that had been quietly seeded through channels I'll never fully admit to controlling. Is it true your family left your sister bleeding on the roadside after a car accident and never reported it to police? The silence in that room, Talia told me later, lasted almost 11 full seconds. Cedric stammered something about a private family matter, about the media twisting a tragedy, but the damage bloomed instantly, the way damage always does once truth finally gets loose. Within a week, 2 of his endorsements evaporated. His campaign manager, a woman named Odalise Reyes, resigned citing irreconcilable concerns about candidate transparency. I watched it all from a distance, the way you'd watch weather roll in over hills you used to call home. There was a night around then when I almost called him. My thumb hovered over his name in my phone for nearly 4 minutes. I remembered him as a boy, 9 years old, carrying me on his back through a flooded backyard so my shoes wouldn't get ruined. I remembered loving him with the uncomplicated fierceness only a little sister can hold. Then I remembered his hand on the car door. Pulling. Not helping. I put the phone down. Cedric didn't win his primary. He didn't come close. And somewhere in the wreckage of his campaign, a question started spreading through our old neighborhood, whispered on porches and in beauty shops. What really happened to Amara Whitfield? Nobody had an answer yet, but everybody wanted one. I need to tell you about the glove box now, because I promised myself I would tell this story honestly, even the parts that make my chest tighten. My father, Marcus Whitfield, had been skimming money from Odessa Whitfield's business for almost 6 years before she died. Not thousands. Not a careless mistake made in a hard month. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, funneled through fake vendor invoices into a shell account, slowly bleeding the company my grandmother had built from nothing. I found out by accident. 2 months before the crash, I'd been helping Grandma Odessa organize old paperwork for her lawyer, and I found a folder she'd hidden inside a hatbox in her closet: bank statements, invoices, a private investigator's report with my father's name circled in red ink 3 separate times. I confronted her about it. She was quiet for a long moment, then she told me something I've never forgotten. Baby, some people you love with your whole chest, and they still find a way to take from you. Doesn't mean you stop loving them. Means you stop being foolish about them. She rewrote her will 2 weeks later. What was in the glove box the night of the accident, the thing my mother hissed about while I lay dying beside them, was a copy of that private investigator's report, the one Marcus had apparently stolen from Grandma Odessa's study after her funeral, trying to destroy every piece of evidence before the will could be read. They weren't just fleeing a car accident. They were fleeing what would happen if paramedics or police or anyone official searched that vehicle and found proof of my father's theft sitting in the glove box beside his daughter's blood on the seat. I didn't know all of this until I was already 6 months into my recovery, when Cassandra Boone finally showed me the full case file she'd been quietly building since before Odessa's death: bank records, timestamps, a video from a gas station camera showing my father transferring a folder from Grandma's house into our family car 3 days before the crash. I sat in Cassandra's office and read it all twice. Then I asked her one question: what happens to a man who steals from a dying woman and then leaves his own daughter bleeding to cover it up? Cassandra didn't answer right away. She just slid a business card across the desk, a detective's name, someone she trusted, someone who owed her a favor. I picked up the card. My hand didn't shake. For the first time since the crash, I understood exactly what kind of door I was about to open next. I went to see my mother alone. Not for reconciliation. For information. Vivian Whitfield had aged in 14 months, more than she had in the previous 14 years. I noticed it the second she opened the door of the house I grew up in, the gray threading through hair she used to dye religiously every 6 weeks, the new lines carved deep around her mouth like something had been chewing on her from the inside. Amara. My name came out of her like a held breath finally released. For one disorienting second, I thought she might cry, might reach for me, might say something close to sorry. Instead, she said, "You shouldn't have come here." That told me everything I needed to know about who she'd been protecting all along. We sat in the kitchen where I'd eaten 10,000 childhood breakfasts, and I watched my mother's hands tremble around a coffee cup she never drank from. "Why did you leave me?" I asked. Plain. No performance in it. She looked at the window instead of at me. "Your father said if we stayed, if the police searched the car." She stopped herself. "You knew what was in the glove box," I said. Not a question. Her silence answered for her. "I could have died, Ma." My voice cracked on the last word, the first crack I'd allowed myself in months. I was 17 minutes from bleeding out on that shoulder. A stranger saved my life. Not you. Not Daddy. Not Renee. Not Cedric. A stranger named Otis who didn't owe me anything. "We panicked," she whispered. "You had time to think about a folder," I said, "but you didn't have time to think about me." The kitchen went silent except for the tick of the clock Grandma Odessa had given her 20 years earlier, one of the few things in that house that had never lied to anyone. Then my mother said the thing that finally, completely, closed the last door in my chest that had still, foolishly, stayed cracked open for her. "Your father is a good man who made one mistake. I need you to understand that before you do something you can't take back." She wasn't asking me to forgive him. She was asking me to protect him. Still. Even now. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor like a small, final punctuation mark. I already gave the detective everything, I said quietly. Grandma Odessa's investigators report. The gas station footage. Cassandra's financial records. It's done, Ma. It's already moving. My mother's face went the color of ash. You'll destroy this family, she said. No, I said, walking to the door, my hand steady on the handle. You did that the night you drove away. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, quiet and undramatic, the way most real endings are, not like the movies, no sirens, no dragging anyone out in handcuffs on the evening news. Just two detectives, a folder of evidence 18 months in the making, and my father's face crumbling in his own driveway as neighbors pretended not to watch from behind their curtains. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Cassandra called me the moment it happened, and I stood in my new kitchen, smaller than the one I grew up in, but entirely, fiercely mine, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph. Grief. Because underneath the anger, underneath 14 months of rebuilding my body and my resolve, there was still a little girl inside me who used to sit on Marcus Whitfield's shoulders at community parades, who used to believe her father hung the moon. That girl grieved him even as the version of him who left her bleeding on a highway shoulder finally faced consequences. Both things were true. I've learned that grief and justice aren't opposites. Sometimes they arrive in the same breath. The embezzlement charges were the least of what came out. Once investigators started pulling threads, they found irregularities stretching back further than even Grandma Odessa had known: falsified permits on 2 of the store locations, an insurance fraud claim from years earlier that I hadn't even known about, a pattern of quiet, careful theft from a woman who had trusted her only son with everything she'd built. The community that had once whispered my father's name with respect began whispering it with something closer to disgust. The beauty supply chain's remaining board members, terrified of further scandal, voted unanimously to formalize what the will had already made true: full operational control of Whitfield Enterprises transferred entirely to me. I hadn't asked for that. I hadn't needed to. The doors were closing themselves now, one after another, dominoes tipping in a line I'd only had to start. Renee called me that night, sobbing, asking how I could do this to our family. I didn't do anything, I told her, and for the first time in 14 months, I meant it completely. I just stopped covering for the people who did. She hung up on me. I let her. Outside my window, the city lights blinked on one by one as the sun went down, and I thought about how strange it was that endings and beginnings so often wear the same face. There's a version of this story where I could have stopped there. Justice served, thief exposed, business restored to its rightful owner. A neat, satisfying ending for a video, I know. But real life doesn't close its doors quite so cleanly, and neither did mine. 3 weeks after my father's arrest, Talia showed up at my apartment unannounced, eyes swollen from crying, and told me something that cracked the ground open beneath everything I thought I understood. Cedric hadn't wanted to leave me on that road. According to Talia, who'd heard it secondhand from Renee in a moment of drunken, guilty honesty, my brother had actually opened his door that night, had actually started to climb out of the car to come back for me. Before my father grabbed his arm and told him, in a voice Renee described as cold in a way none of us had ever heard, that if Cedric got out of that car, he'd be disowned on the spot, cut off from the family, the business, everything, the same night. Cedric was 24. Struggling. Terrified of ending up like our Uncle Desmond, who'd been cut off from the family 15 years earlier and had spent the rest of his life sleeping in a series of increasingly desperate places until he died, alone, in a shelter 3 winters ago. I sat with that information for a long time after Talia left. It didn't erase what happened. Cedric still stayed in that car. He still let his hand fall away from the door instead of pushing it open. But for the first time, I understood the shape of the fear that had held him there. It didn't make me forgive him, but it made me understand him, which is a different kind of door, one I hadn't expected to find still standing, half open, in the wreckage of everything else. I didn't reach out to him. Not yet. Some doors need time before you know whether to walk through them or nail them permanently shut. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned. I called Cassandra Boone and asked her to draft something new, not an attack, not a strategy, but an offer. A scholarship in Grandma Odessa's name, specifically for young people trying to break cycles of fear and silence in families like mine. I named the first recipient anonymously. Nobody but Cassandra and I would ever know it was Cedric's daughter, my 6-year-old niece Journey, whose only crime was being born into a family still learning how to stop hurting each other. Some doors, I was learning, you close to protect yourself. Others, you leave cracked open for the people still inside who never got the chance to choose. The final door belonged to me. 8 months after my father's arrest, I stood in the doorway of Odessa Whitfield's original store, the very first location she'd opened 41 years earlier with a loan nobody believed she'd pay back and a stubbornness nobody could talk her out of. The paint on the sign had faded to a soft, dignified gray. I'd chosen not to repaint it. Some things earn the right to show their age. We were holding a small ceremony that day, nothing extravagant, nothing like the wedding my sister once dreamed of. Just employees who'd worked for my grandmother for decades, community members whose small businesses had been rebuilt through the incubator program, and Otis Green, the trucker who'd pulled me from a ditch and never once asked for anything in return. Sitting in the front row in a suit that looked freshly pressed for the first time in years. I hadn't invited my parents. I hadn't invited Renee. I had invited Cedric. He came alone, without Journey, dressed simply, standing near the back like a man unsure he'd earned the right to take up space in the room. When our eyes met across the crowd, neither of us smiled. But neither of us looked away either. After the ceremony, he approached me slowly, hands shoved deep in his pockets, the same nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. "I should have opened that door," he said. No preamble. No excuses dressed up as explanations. "You should have," I agreed. "I think about it every single day." "Good," I said, and I meant it without cruelty. "You should." We stood there in silence for a long moment, the noise of the small crowd swirling around us, and I felt something inside my chest shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever fully. But something adjacent to it. Something with room to grow, if he proved, over time, that he wanted to. "I'm not going to pretend that night didn't happen," I told him. "I'm not going to pretend you're the same as them either." He nodded, eyes wet, and for the first time in almost 2 years, my brother looked like someone I might, eventually, choose to know again. I didn't offer him a job. I didn't offer him money. I offered him the only thing that actually mattered. Time. And the smallest, most fragile crack of an open door. People ask me sometimes, in the rare interviews I agree to, whether I regret what happened to my family. The business collapsing under my father's exposed theft. My mother's isolation, friends quietly drifting away once the full story became public. My sister's marriage, which happened eventually, in a small ceremony with none of the grandeur she'd once wanted, funded modestly and paid for herself. I always give the same answer: I didn't do this to them. They did this to themselves the night they chose a folder of stolen paperwork over their own daughter's life. What I did was simply stop protecting the silence that let it happen. I stopped covering cracks in a foundation that had been rotting long before that highway, long before that crash, long before I ever understood what family was supposed to mean and what mine had decided, instead, to make it mean. Grandma Odessa used to say that a door only closes on you if you let someone else hold the handle. For most of my life, I let my family hold every handle in my world, decided when I was welcome, when I was useful, when I was worth stopping the car for. Not anymore. Whitfield Enterprises has tripled in size since I took over. The scholarship fund now carries 41 names, one for every year of my grandmother's original store, and I add a new one every year on the anniversary of the night I nearly died. Otis Green has a permanent seat on our community advisory board, and he still calls me kiddo even though I sign his consulting checks now. My mother and I speak sometimes, careful, brief conversations that neither of us pretend are more than what they are. My father, out on parole after a plea deal, has reached out exactly once. I haven't answered. Cedric and I are rebuilding, slowly, deliberately, the way you rebuild anything worth keeping, with patience and honesty, and the understanding that some cracks leave scars even after they heal. Renee and I are still finding our way back, if there is a way back at all. Some days I think there is. Some days I'm not sure. But I know this much. Sitting here with the scar above my eyebrow catching the evening light, I am no longer the girl bleeding on the shoulder of that road, waiting for someone to come back for her. I came back for myself. And every door that was once open to the people who left me is closing, one by one, not because I'm cruel. Because I finally stopped holding it open for them. The end.